Good evening, everybody. I am Todd Goldberg. I am the director of the Low Residency MFA in Creative Writing and Writing for the Performing Arts at UCR Palm Desert. And I am so pleased to welcome you all here tonight for the, I don't know how many virtual versions of Arts and Letters we have done, but we have tried to do as many as possible during this godforsaken pandemic, because you know what is cool? We can do this stuff. We don't need to be in person to do it. And frankly, sometimes it's a little better not to be in person because, I mean, I like you guys, but people touch my face and it's weird. That's not going to happen tonight. We have a fantastic group of people here watching, and we have two fantastic authors joining me in the Zoom box tonight to talk about their brand new hyper acclaimed memoirs. We're going to talk about their books. We'll leave spoilers out as much as we possibly can. We're going to talk about their careers, and we'll give you guys plenty of time to ask some questions. Again, post the questions in the Q&A in the box down there at the bottom, and I will pull out questions and get to them. The program will last about an hour, maybe a little bit longer, but in time for you to get right back to Rachel Maddow that you're DVRing without any sort of delay. I promise you nothing bad is going to happen in the next hour. Well, let's meet our guests, shall we? I feel like I'm hosting the Hollywood Squares. Let's see here. Should we go alphabetically? I guess we'll go alphabetically. Our first guest is Gina Frangelo. She is the author of the brand new memoir, Blow Your House Down, a story of family, feminism, and treason, out now from Counterpoint Press. It received starred reviews in all the places that give starred reviews. She had a great review in Bustle just the other day. It is everywhere right now. In addition to being her debut memoir, Gina has also been the author of several successful books, including Life in Men, Slut Lullabies, and Every Kind of Wanting, plus also My Sister's Continent, the wildly underread. You guys should go find expensive used copies on Abe Books of My Sister's Continent. She was also the editor of Other Voices Books, which published a lot of great books, including two of mine. So I have to be nice to her because she was my editor. But more importantly than that, I've known Gina since 1996, when inexplicably, she accepted a short story of mine for her literary magazine, Other Voices, and that launched my career. And I don't mean that facetiously. It was the second story I had sold, and it changed the course of my life. So, Gina Frangelo, Blow Your House Down, out right now. Welcome, Gina.
Thank you.
And joining Gina tonight, I think this is the third time we've had Emily Rapp Black as part of Arts and Letters. And she also joined me last summer to talk about TV shows that were streaming. Little Fires Everywhere.
What was it?
Little Fires Everywhere.
Anyway, Big Little Something.
Her brand new book, Sanctuary, is out right now. She is the New York Times bestselling author of Poster Child and also The Still Point of the Turning World. Her essays have appeared everywhere. Every single place that you can imagine an essay appearing, Emily Rapp Black has had an essay there. She is a professor of creative writing at UC Riverside, so she is my colleague as well. And I first met Emily in a bar in Long Beach, I think.
What?
Isn't that where we first met? I feel like that's where we first met.
You're wrong.
I think it was like Rob took us to a show.
No, we met on a panel.
Oh, I forgot. We met at a panel.
Yeah.
I didn't start to like her, however, until we went to a bar in Long Beach.
So rude. It was you and Rob and Bruce Bauman. It was like romper room. It was
Oh, that's right. I remember now.
I was like, whoa. Yeah.
Her brand new book, Sanctuary, has been praised all over the planet as well, getting all the starred reviews in all the right places. Also, these are two books that I have to tell you, even though I knew the stories inside of them, I did not know how they would move me right here in my own home. You will laugh a great deal in both of these books, which is surprising. You will also sob like a baby in both of these books, which is not surprising. But you will never, ever leave the page without thinking that these two women are two of the very best writers in the world. And I am so pleased to have them here today. So let's get into your books. Welcome, both of you, and thank you for spending a little bit of time with me here tonight. in our Zoom boxes. So we're going to talk, like I said, about your books, of course, but I want to start off with both of you just to sort of get the sense of, when did you start as young people paying attention to the things that were happening around you? When did you know that you wanted to remember certain things, whether or not you knew you were going to write about them? When did you begin to sort of catalog emotion? Gina, we'll start with you.
Well, so I was a freak. I mean, I was writing little books when I was 4 years old. I didn't even really know how to write yet. I could write a little bit, but I would illustrate and then I would dictate it to my mother, and she would make it. We'd staple it together and so forth. But by the time I was 10, I was writing my first novel.
Oh my
And
gosh.
my mom, I grew up really poor, and so my mother would buy these rolls of like weird orange butcher block paper and like rip it off for me because it was the cheapest way to deal with my habit. And I wrote 4 novels between the ages of 10 and 15. All about the same characters, upon which I then got a driver's license and started partying and forgot about writing until I was in college, and then returned to it. I studied with like Lori Moore and Ann Packer in college, and started publishing short fiction right out of college and so forth.
But so when you were writing your middle grade series of novels, your 4 books with continuing characters, were you parroting your life? Were you making stuff up? What were you doing?
So I think I was addressing my life metaphorically. I was writing about 4 characters: Genevieve, Karen, Patrick, and Frank, who lived in an orphanage because, of course, all children's literature, all the parents are dead. So I mean, I had read that, and so there it was. But I grew up in a neighborhood where there was a lot of very visible abuse of both children and women. And I noticed that very young. I think because I was an extremely avid reader, I realized that there were environments where that wasn't necessarily happening. And there were also environments that were calling that out for happening. And so I wrote this orphanage, this place that these 4 kids lived, where they were being mistreated. And it was kind of a metaphor for where I was in my neighborhood. And I think like I lived very vicariously through that because I couldn't articulate what I felt was problematic about my surroundings, because everyone else, it's like a small town. An urban neighborhood is very much like a small town where it's like everyone knows each other, and there's sort of like the devotion to the small town or to the neighborhood. And I had some of that too, and there are always going to be parts that I miss, but I also felt like, okay, some things here are really fucked up and I can't talk about it, so it went here.
Interesting. So pretty early then you were processing the world through narrative. What about for you, Emily? When did it begin?
I mean, I used to write crime fiction. I know. Actually, the most plot-driven stuff I've ever written. It's like, I don't know, I think it was about like a Beverly Hills murder or something. I was like obsessed with Hollywood. That was probably in like 2nd grade, maybe 1st grade. But I had insomnia as a kid. I was also a freak. And so I used to stay up late, reading Little House on the Prairie, which I'm sure says so many things about me that are disturbing and weird. But anyway, I love those books. And then I actually had a character. It makes me think when you said that, Gina. I mean, I used to write bad poems, and like I would I would write down Bible stories but change the end, and then or I would speak into a little tape recorder and make up stories about this witch I called Winifred. But I had this character that when we were hiking when I was a kid, I would pretend that I was like this frontierswoman called Jenny, who like pretended to be a boy and got in a wagon and like went and was digging gold.
So Jenny was very, very busy.
Robust. So I definitely feel like story was also a way of processing, like, when I had my leg amputated, like the books you had available were like, look, this person had cancer and died. Right. Or, oh, look, this person became like a hiker and then like climbed a mountain. So I was kind of making up my own stories that didn't necessarily have to do with disability, but were probably like circling around that a little bit.
And were your parents encouraging you to write?
I'm not sure if they knew what I was doing. Like, I mean, I was like, I would stay up reading. They probably did. I don't know. They're here. They can tell me. But I mean, you know,
we're gonna bring them on.
Now, of course, I'm like 8:30, but like I was one of those kids who was like trying to read at the flashlight or like read in the closet. I'm not sure what that means. But yeah, I mean, we were big readers in the family. Definitely, that was encouraged. Yeah.
Because, you know, one of the things that both of your books share is both of you are interpreting both trauma and grief through literature, you know, and so for me, as I'm reading both of your books, I'm thinking, you know, is this a conscious choice to do it in the written word? Obviously, like you're writing both of your books in a particular way, right? But is it also a learned behavior that your weird bad shit's happening to you and you're using it as a compare contrast to the things that you've read or the things that you've seen? Is that part of it for you, Emily?
I mean, I feel like, you know, if I started out as a reader who found solace in books, not escapism, but just like a way of feeling less lonely. And I never liked the books that everyone else liked, of course, and I still don't actually, but I think yeah, I mean, I think it was a learned behavior. And I also think that when you grow up really loving story, you understand that every story is sort of calling out every other story that's ever been written or won't be written or is being written right now. And I like that. I like the conversation aspect of it was really powerful. And I think when I went to college, I took this course. It was 2 years called The Great Conversation. And we all lived in the same dorm and we studied like from the Greeks up to the Enlightenment. It was like a classics program. And I think that was also really like foundational for me because it was just like, oh, wow, these ideas are really old.
Right. What about for you, Gina?
So, I mean, actually, one of the first things I want to say is that I, as a longtime fiction writer, I mean, I've been writing short form nonfiction for 20 years, but primarily my books were, of course, all fiction. But it was Emily's work that really kind of cracked open for me the fact that you didn't have to either be critical theory or personal essay, that like you could do both. I wasn't a really avid reader of creative nonfiction. I had certain memoirs that had been really formative to me, like Maxine Hung Kingston's The Woman Warrior, which, you know, just blew my mind, particularly as winning the National Book Award in the early 70s for being so speculative and like fantasy oriented, but everything filtered through the lens of the author. But I met Emily by writing her fan mail. I mean, I loved her work. I was reading her work on Little Seal and I wrote her and I was like, I'm editing at the Nervous Breakdown on the Rumpus and I really want to publish you and I think that you're amazing. And her work and the way that she employed theory and popular culture and theology and philosophy and all of these things into personal narrative was very formative to me because that was sort of the key to unlocking what was interesting to me about creative nonfiction. I had done some fairly, you know, straight form personal essays, but I wasn't as compelled by it as I was by writing fiction or by reading critical theory, which was always a great passion of mine, reading feminist theory, all different types of literary theory. And so that integration has been, you know, enormously compelling to me. And I think, you know, I mean, I didn't grow up in a house with a lot of books. My parents had been readers when they were young. My mother loved Dostoevsky. You know, they had very avidly, like, they were into jazz, they were into foreign films and so forth. But by the time I was growing up, you know, we were entrenched in this neighborhood. And I mean, we had sort of like one shelf of books and that was more than anyone else had. You know, my people would come in my house and be like, your parents are really brainy, huh? Like their parents.
They love this. Like, Harold Robbins seems great.
But yeah, and my mother had a book inscribed to her by the author. It was called Understanding the City Child by Dorothy Thompson, who was a friend of hers.
Oh my God.
And actually Dorothy Thompson had been an assistant of John Updike. And so all the, like, my mom had this like little sliver of interest in the literary community. And I would read the dedication, like, I didn't read the books. I was really young. I would read, like, the inscription to my mom, and I would just be like, this is magic. Right. So I always loved that sense of like books as communication.
Well, and to me, I think both of your books seem like they're in a conversation with literature, and they're in a conversation obviously with the culture, but obviously it's also about yourselves. And in that way, I was thinking about some of these books that I remember from long ago, like The Bridge Called My Name, or Women Who Run with Wolves, where it's women who are reckoning with deep truths, but they're also doing it through this lens of this history of literature about women like them, essentially. And I thought, man, like, these books really fit nicely into that area, but it's also something larger than that, which is that both of you are talking about things that are, in essence, kind of a taboo. Like, no one wants to come up and immediately have a conversation with anyone about loss or the end of a marriage. Like, that's the last thing anyone wants to talk about, but we're going to have an evening all about it. So I'm wondering if using that device for either of you helps sort of bridge that gap between the uncomfortableness of the topic itself. And either of you can answer.
I mean, I definitely feel like it does. I mean, I think part of what you're referring to is like, if you have any kind of story that stops the conversation at a party, then people say outrageous things to you all the time and think that they're being helpful, and they're not. So some examples, I couldn't do it. I can't imagine. I would die if I were you, a personal favorite. And it's just like, that feels like a trap, and it feels like a prison. And it's like, I think a lot of the bringing in other people who've made, or writers and thinkers who've maybe been in a similar situation or grappled with similar feelings, is a way of being like, yes, well, I'm not the cursed person that you maybe want to put your curse on, because you don't want to empathize with it because it's too painful. And yeah, I mean, that can be brutalizing to go into the world and people know things about you and they say dumb things, and it's hurtful. And so I think for me, memoir has always been in some ways a kind of shield, like, oh, what happened to you? Like, I don't know how many times in my life I've heard that. And I'm like, I wrote a book and you can order it on Amazon. Stop speaking to me. Like, be quiet, shut up. Like, and I mean, it's true. It's like, that I think is like, it's preserved my. Yes.
Real life, ladies and gentlemen, it interludes.
Yes, you can cross the street. Preserved some kind of privacy for me in a sense. Yeah, because you're like, oh, this is how it was for me, and that's only a little bit of how it was.
Right. What about for you, Gina?
Well, so definitely, like, I mean, I devoured a lot of critical theory that was about these types of topics that I think both Emily and I write about. But I think it wasn't really until, so I got breast cancer in 2016. I was diagnosed at the end of 2015, but all my treatment was in 2016. And I made at the time, complicated decision to actually talk about it on social media. To show pictures of myself bald, to talk about what it was like to have like expanders planted in your body, to talk about chemo and neutropenic fever and all these different things. And I started getting a lot of letters from women who were saying, I've never been able to talk about this. I've been so ashamed. I felt people would look at me differently. No one knows that I had cancer, these things. And so that, I think, for me was kind of the tipping point of realizing that, like, if women are not able to even talk about something that happens through sheer like genetic bad luck to their bodies for which they have no responsibility, then how silenced are women who maybe have had an extramarital affair or who have done
Right.
things, you know, outside the bounds of acceptability? And I started thinking about the fact that you know, I had not found books that were talking about kind of the cataclysmic, like full catastrophe living of being a middle-aged woman. That a lot of memoirs were focused on kind of the misadventures of youth.
Mhm.
And then everyone was sort of healed and the sky parted, you know, when they got to a certain age, they got married, they had children, boom, your internal life stops, and you know, happy, happy, the end. And for me, you know, that was my story until it wasn't.
Right.
And I really felt like the thing that prompted me to want to write about these things was the fact that I felt there were so many women out there who did not feel not only that they had any place to talk about it, but that there weren't books that were reflecting these experiences. You could buy self-help books about divorce,
Right.
about overcoming infidelity, about cancer, about grieving the death of a parent, the death of a friend. But all these things were happening simultaneously to me at once. And it was sort of like it wasn't a self-help situation. It was thicker than that. It was
Mhm.
messier than that. There wasn't going to be this kind of inspirational and then the end, and then everything was solved. And I wanted other women to be able to feel seen. And that was, I think, the driving force of my book.
Well, and the other thing, and it's sort of related, and this is true for both of you in your books, is that I was struck by is amidst all of this, there is this very firm bond of friendship between very close female friends, right? These other women who supported you through the best and the worst of your lives without judgment on either, right? And for you, Gina, it was often Kathy, but also other women as well. Um, and it seemed to me that outside of everything else that your books are about, they're also both about the power of a different kind of love, and that is that love between two women, two friends. Can you speak to that, both of you?
I would love to speak to that. I mean, I think that, you know, so other than Elena Ferrante, who is, of course, a genius and everyone should read My Brilliant Friend and all of its sequels, but that this has been a really underrepresented aspect of literature. You know, it's often misrepresented that female friendships are just kind of like catty and competitive, and for me, I mean, that, you know, all relationships, if you're really intimate with someone, it's complicated.
Right.
But my friendships with other women have been a consistent lifeline throughout my life. I know the same is true for Emily. And so my third novel, which is called A Life in Men, um, is a bit of an ironic title because it's really about the deep intimacy and love between two high school girls, early college girls. One of them dies quite young, and the other one kind of can't get past her death. And I was I was publishing that book right after my friend Kathy died, within a very quick 4-month period after being diagnosed with ovarian cancer, and within 4 months she was dead. And after Kathy's death, I mean, there was a hole in my life that I would not have been able to acknowledge or realize prior to her being gone, you
Mhm.
know. And I think that there is this encouragement. I actually think it's even stronger for men than it is for women. I think a lot of men, middle-aged men, don't have many close relationships outside of their marriage or their colleagues at work. But that there's this idea that friendship becomes less important over time, that like your friends are not as crucial. Oh, you know, you have your spouse, you have your children, you have your family. And for me, friendship has always been just incredibly crucial. and non-judgmental friendship, which I have found, I mean, I found it with male friends as well, but I found it certainly with a very close group,
Any men in specific?
a very close group of women friends. And I think that it's part of what's not talked about enough about what it is to be a grown-ass adult. It's as though friendship is somehow the complex terrain of the young, and then it just all becomes, everything about being over a certain age becomes a bit flatlined in literature. And so definitely the relationships between women, and the way that sometimes we think they've taken a back seat to other things, but something wakes us up to the fact that they haven't,
Right.
is one of the most interesting things in the world to me.
And Emily, in your book, I was thinking specifically about a couple of scenes. There's one very moving scene when Tara comes and is helping you go through your clothes, throwing out what you don't need. But then another when you're at the OBGYN looking to see if you are pregnant for a second time, where you have brought people with you to moments that are going to be pivotal.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder, like, is that part of this notion of friendship where you realize I need to have another person there to witness this moment?
So the interesting thing about that is that I didn't ask those people, they offered. Or they just showed up. Like, or like I'm getting on a plane, or, I'm, a couple people I didn't know that well were like, I just booked a flight to Albuquerque, arriving at 3. I'm like, okay, so I think that maybe is one of the things that I've experienced in female friendships. They don't ask to be helpful. They just do it. They show up.
Mm-hmm.
And have whatever reaction, and sort of witness things in a way that isn't about them, is about the situation, and they defend you. I mean, it's
Right.
like there's no. So yeah, I mean, I think sometimes I definitely have asked people to come and help me, which was something I found really hard to do right after my son was diagnosed, and then I got really used to it and like do it all the time now.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's, I mean, now that I'm in my, how old am I? In my mid 40s, I've had friends now for over half my life, and most of them are the same friends.
Right.
And I also think that a lot of, and also there's another myth about this that I think is dopey, is, you can make new friends all the time. Like you just because you're over a certain age or middle age doesn't mean that you stop making new friends. Like that, I made friends with Gina, not in high school, not in college, but like by choice.
Mm-hmm.
That's true of a lot of my friendships now. And I think like that's another dumb myth that like you like have to say, oh, well, we've been friends since we were 5. And so,
right.
But no, it's like, it's a continuous process of, bonding with people and supporting people. And it's just fantastic.
Well, and I think, for you, Emily, in reading Sanctuary, alongside having read your other 2 books, of course, this notion that I think you've dealt with in essays and also in Sanctuary itself about you being brave, people coming up to you and telling you that you're brave for surviving. And then you address it pretty much head on at the beginning of this book by letting us know you almost threw yourself off of a bridge. And I'm wondering, what, when you're talking about this terrible, palpable grief, and I'm going to try not to cry, of losing Ronan, and then you talk about choosing to save yourself, but putting all of this stuff into a book and saying, look, I'm not brave. I just got to the other side of it, basically. What do you hope that the reader finds for themselves in it? We've learned what literature has done. We've learned what your friends have done. But on the other side of that book is that stranger. What does the stranger take from the book?
It's a good question. I mean, I just think it's like, people find a way to move on. People find a way, they figure it out, or they don't. Like, those are the options. Like, you stand on a bridge or you stand anywhere, you're thinking about, how much easier it would be if you could just stop the pain. And so sometimes that's not the choice people make. sometimes they make a different choice. And I think that it's not intended to be inspirational or brave at all. It's just, that's what I did. I
Right.
didn't do the other thing. And I think sometimes we just, well, and this is especially true of women, like women are pathologized for everything we do. Like, you know, you're a bad woman, you're a bad wife, you're a bad this, you're a bad that, you look too fat, you look too skinny. Like there's nothing we can do that's right. And also that's true with grief. And I think part of it, I mean, maybe what part of that was about is that I felt like that would be, in some ways, I don't talk about this in the book, but it would be I would be judged as a bad mother, or a bad griever, which I have been in subsequent years. So it doesn't really matter. But I wanted to be like, no, you know, I don't want to, it's almost like I was still worried about what people think. Now I don't care. But I mean, I think I don't know. I just feel like there's so much pressure on women in every single respect, in every part of life. We never get it right. We're always told we're doing it wrong. Always.
Yeah.
And I felt like that was a powerful moment for me, because I was like, well, here I am. This is my life.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like the book is basically telling you, like, grieve however the fuck you, oh, pardon me, grieve however you choose to grieve.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
whatever it takes to get you to that other side. And for you also, that means, you know, obsessive exercise. It means risky sexual misadventure. It means rage. It means anger, but it also means, you know, obsessively creating art on top of everything else. You know, that therapy doesn't solve everything, right? Sometimes you got to live.
Well, it also reminds me of this line from the show The Fall, where Gillian Anderson says, men's biggest fear is that we'll make fun of them, and women's biggest fear is that they'll kill us.
Right. Yeah, that was a big moment in our home when I turned to my wife and I was like, is that true? And she was like, have you not been listening to the world for 50 years, Todd? That was a good night. Gina, similarly, but differently, you know, in your book, you are talking about, you know, the realization of grief, that you didn't realize how unhappy you were for how long you were in your marriage. And then dealing with sort of a history of not knowing how upset you were for many, many years. And then finally making this choice to break out of the marriage that you're in and have a different life. But on the other side of that is a reader, right? And that reader might not have the same experiences that you're having. They're reading your book for whatever reason they're reading your book. What is that thing that you want them to see in your life that might matter to them?
I think all women, regardless of social class, regardless of race, regardless of background, are encouraged towards artifice, towards performance. And that artifice and that performance differs depending on your positionality. For me, so growing up as someone who was in poverty, who, you know, my father had been born in the house, you know, the little 1-bedroom apartment I lived in. Everybody had been there forever since their family had come from Italy, from Puerto Rico. And there was not a sense of like ambition was treason. Ambition was frowned upon. And as a result of that, I was very reactive to that. And so I had a fantasy world in which on the other side of the ambition, you know, it was somewhere over the rainbow. It was like this pretend world where everything was going to be perfect and misogyny wouldn't exist and violence against children wouldn't exist. And, you know, just I talk in my book, I don't know if any of you in the audience are old enough to remember, but like I had this big girl crush on Joyce Davenport from Hill Street Blues, you know, and I just sort of idolized this idea of sort of, you know, I mean, I came of age during second wave feminism, but in a neighborhood that feminism forgot, right? And so I was seeing it on TV and I was like, okay, once I get out of here, it's going to be like this. And it was very, very difficult for me over a lot of years to have to admit that this thing that, first of all, I mistook for a personal success. Like, so getting out of my neighborhood, which really was largely due to my mother's incredible encouragement and to just having been born able to take a test well and get a scholarship and get into a particular college or whatever. So I have this, first of all, this mythology within myself of specialness because I had gotten out. And if you believe that mythology of specialness because you've gotten out, you also, in a sense, have to drink the Kool-Aid of now the place you've gotten to is perfect. And none of those woes and horrors of where you come from exist in this new place. And so for a long time, it was really important to me to believe that about both myself and about the world around me. And it was a very slow realization that, yes, my world now differs enormously from the world in which I grew up. But one of the ways it does not differ is that the roles of women are very prescriptive, dependency, just certain roles in the domestic sphere, the idea of martyrdom, the idea of giving up the inner life, the personal self in favor of soul and unilateral focus on others and making others happy. Realizing that the new world in which I was in, things were just happening behind closed doors instead of out in the open.
Right.
In the neighborhood I was from, we didn't have social workers in the schools. We didn't have, we didn't have anyone who was saying, where does that bruise come from? We didn't have anyone who was calling DCFS. It was, you could openly, you could gang rape somebody and all the other women in the neighborhood would come to the defense of the rapists and give them alibis. And so, of course, after that, obviously it was quite easy to think that now I had found myself in utopia. And the slow realization that no, that I had bought into this myth of my own specialness, and I had bought into the myth of this perfect world beyond the escape. That was hard.
Mm-hmm.
And it took me a lot of years to acknowledge that, because I had to give up a lot of ideas about myself and I had to give up a lot of ideas about my world, and kind of start fresh and be like, I don't really know what's going on.
Well, and you do an interesting thing in the book that's not sort of dissimilar from Emily on the Bridge, which also is a great name for a YA novel, which is that at the top of the book, and then also to a different extent at the end of the book, you essentially address the reader with what they're thinking about you, right? Like, you tell the reader, I know you're thinking at different points in the book, like, she left her phone out. What is up? You call yourself a dumb bitch who left her phone out for her children to see the text with your now husband. That's addressing the reader. But you also are calling yourself a stupid whore because you think I'm a stupid whore and all these things. You think I'm this, you think I'm that. Essentially telling the reader that you are aware of what society believes about you. And now you're going to argue your case about why maybe part of that is true, but you don't know how this got to be in that way. It's a very self-analytical and personally horrifying, I don't know if I can do it, way of saying, look, I don't give a shit what you think of me. Did that develop organically, or was that also part of you trying to reckon with your own decision making?
I mean, I think it's complex. First of all, there's nothing that I think the reader thinks of me that I didn't at some point think of myself. So, so essentially I'm talking about the interior narrative. As Emily said, there's no right way to be a woman. And so all of those thoughts, I mean, there's nothing the reader could think about me that I didn't call myself and think about myself. But but also as a fiction writer, I also understood that the point of a book is not you have to love the heroine and think that everything she did was right.
Right.
The star of the book must be virtuous in all ways, must be inspirational to you. And certainly that's always been a right afforded to men, right? I mean, obviously we have, look at Lolita, for God's sakes. I mean, so I had to, in a sense, externalize myself, put myself on the page and be like, this is me and not me. I mean, it's me. I did this stuff, but it's also not the entirety of me. And yet, okay, here I am. I'm about to do this.
Right.
You're not going to like it, people. I'm not. I don't recommend trying it at home, but it's what happened. And I believe in the messy, complicated, not necessarily traditionally sympathetic protagonist. And the realization that I had been writing those people my entire literary
career,
while on the other hand trying to be this flawlessly sympathetic kind of model person that everyone would like. And the schism of that and the bullshit of that, and that, I'm sorry if I'm blue or I'm not supposed to be on the recording, but I wanted to call that out of the book. I mean, I wanted to talk about that. I wanted to essentially say, like, I tried to play this role, and it's not who I am, and judge me as you will, because this book is not about what you think of me. Right. This book is about a larger picture than that.
And I don't know if you believe this, but it seems to me like you had to go through it to have that belief to write about it, that you couldn't have written this at 35 if you'd gone through the same thing.
No. In fact, I wrote some really kind of, in retrospect, sanctimonious essays when I was in my 30s and had just had my kids, adopted my daughters, and about how, like, oh, I used to be like this and now I'm so, healed and psychologically healthy now, and isn't it sad that I used to be this way, and I didn't consider how much life is a circle and how much we're always spiraling around the same things, and that unfortunately or fortunately, like, it doesn't just stop at a certain point and you get to say, now everything is better. So I mean, I think that we've always allowed men, but we've started to allow young women that space of messing up, of being unsympathetic, of doing things wrong that later they'll be redeemed for. But I think it's still a space that we don't very easily allow women above a certain age, certainly women who are mothers. And, the book is not about advocating and saying, like, oh yes, everything I did was right and you should be on my side and you should think that you should do all this too. It's more about people are messy, and certain people have been granted messy humanity and other people have not.
Right. Well, and your idea of this circular notion of time, which is also a line from a Rolling Stones song, it reminds me of the non-linear nature, Emily, in what you're writing about in Sanctuary. Your grief that you're talking about in Sanctuary does not exist on an easy ABC line. You are shifting all the way to your childhood, to present day, to 5 minutes ago, throughout this entire book. And for one, it reminds me of just how the human mind works, right? Like, we are constantly going through the newsreel of our emotions. But I'm wondering if you can speak to that nature of nonlinear time in your emotions, and how the grief does not just, there's that great line that you quote from Louise Gluck about, at the end of the grief, a door opened, and I'm paraphrasing poorly, but that notion that you can live inside of these feelings without bifurcating it, that the time doesn't really matter with it.
Yeah, it's interesting because time is a big part of it, right? It's like, I was just talking to or working on a podcast with a friend of mine, and we were talking about that moment when someone dies, like all of the times collapse into one moment where time is everything and nothing at all. And that's really profound and also really brutalizing. It's all the things all at once in 1 second that you can't quantify.
Right.
So absolutely. I mean, I feel like there's, I think what I like about that Louise Gluck poem is that the image of the door is that I also, like Gina, thought that I would someday come to the right room and be in the right place and all the things would be right and all the furniture would be good. And, but that doesn't really happen to most people. And it's painful to realize that. It's also part of what makes someone complicated. And I also just think that people don't get over stuff. Like nobody does. And it's like, at some point in my life, I will be the only person living who remembers my son, like as a person, or who acknowledges my son. And that's awful. That's an awful feeling, but it's also, that's reality. So that sometimes when I think about that, I feel really sad. Or sometimes when I'm, in certain moments when my child is about to come in and interrupt me. Yes, Charlie? Okay.
How many minutes until your meeting?
Well, it's going to be a little bit.
Hi, Charlie. Just a couple more minutes.
Okay, 10.
I want to go to the YMCA and ride my bike.
Okay.
Messy life.
Life does get a little messy.
No, but I mean, back to that circular thing too. It's like, I think women are not necessarily encouraged to embrace reinvention in any respect, unless it's like getting skinny, having plastic surgery. And I don't judge those things at all and love my Botox, but like, I think that's the reinvention. And it's all under this like patriarchal banner of pleasing.
Right. Well, you also talk a lot in the book about the notion of dark matter. And you talk about it both for what it actually is, and then metaphorically about essentially where Ronan is, right? The dark matter of his DNA is always going to be inside of you from having given birth to him, just like Charlie's is. But this talking about dark matter and talking about energy and the persistence of energy, and what does it all matter? How do you not give into that sort of existential thinking just on a minute by minute basis? I think that's part of what this book, it's not a guide for, but it's like you can allow that in, right? Like you can have that emotion while also saying to your child, yes, we can go to the YMCA later. Like you don't ever have to be one single thing, right?
No, you don't. I mean, I think that it's almost, that's another myth, like to be the single thing. That's kind of what Gina was saying, like the virtuous narrator, the sort of the good woman.
Right.
And although those things are never fully spelled out to us, we know when we're transgressing those definitions. So absolutely. I mean, I feel like part of what I learned, I don't want to say like I learned a lesson from my son, because like I would have liked to learn it other ways, but in the aftermath of his death, just that from moment to moment, the landscape could shift all the time. Like it could be, and there's no way of knowing when that will happen, and there's no way to judge it. Other people will judge it, but in yourself, you can just say, oh wow, that's wow, why I'm crying at a dog food commercial. Okay, like, and it's the same feeling of grief, but you can't really anchor it to anything. And that's what grief is. It's just like, if C.S. Lewis said it, grief feels like fear. You don't know what's going to happen next. Yeah.
So one last thing for both of you, and then we'll take some audience questions. So folks, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A box. So for both of you in your books, sort of inexplicably, and I don't know why it feels inexplicable, but it is, in a book about losing your child, and then Gina in a book about infidelity, both of you spend a lot of time talking about your parents, and your parents are big living creatures in both of your books. And Emily, in yours, your mom, I think, shows up more than your dad, except for a very poignant moment with your dad. Well, there's a few, but there's a great moment late in the book where you've already given birth to Charlie, who we just saw as a walking sentient human, which is always strange, where you've just brought her home, and you're afraid she's going to die, basically.
Yeah.
And she's got a booger stuck in her nose. And so therefore her breathing sounds a little haggard because she has a booger in her nose and is a baby. And your mom basically says to you, you've got to get your shit together.
She said that a lot. Oh, she's gonna love this. She now loves you forever.
and it's a great moment because it's like, your mom has the same fear that you have. Your mom had that same fear. Your mom had you and went through everything that you had to go through with your leg and all of that, and lost Ronan as well. But here she is just being like, she just has a booger in her nose and I'm going to take it out because you're losing your shit. And we'll get to your parents in just one second, but can you talk about the role of your parents, both in this process of grief, but also in this other side of your life that you're in now?
Yeah, I mean, they were definitely, I mean, they showed up for me at every point in Ronan's life and in his death. And I mean, I have to say, like, my mom, I think at that moment just went into nurse mode and was like, getting the booger was like just gonna happen because she was like putting on her nurse hat. She wasn't really doing that. And I think it's like, you know, one of the things I learned from my parents or absorbed from my parents is one of the things, Gina and I talk about this all the time with our parents. Like, no one's parents are perfect. Sorry, mom and dad who are on this, have to be careful. They're on this talk. But like, if you tell your child, I love you, no matter what you do, I love you all the time, and you feel that way, you kind of, you know it, and it enables you to do things that you think you couldn't do. And people that don't have that, and there are many, because there are a lot of shitty parents, they don't have that same belief. And that can be like, lead to real struggle and heartbreak that is hard to imagine if you've had the reverse. And I find it kind of unimaginable, but yet I know that it happens. Like, you know, what Gina was saying, it's like abuse happens all the time. But I think that's it. Like, if your kids know that you love them, even if they are being completely ridiculous, as I have been for most of my life, and slamming doors and shouting and being impossible, like, you are enabled and empowered to do things that you thought you could not get through until it happened.
Gina, for you, you know, you had a unique experience in that you lived with your parents for a very long time, until both of their deaths. They lived in the same house as you. And in sort of in equally heartbreaking terms, you know, in Emily's book, she describes the moment of Ronan's passing from Tay-Sachs, and you described finding your mom after she had been dead for longer than she should have been dead. You both bring us into these moments that none of us have any right to be a part of. But you bring us in, and for me, it makes me feel better about my own life. It makes me feel less alone with the things that I've experienced. And so I'm wondering, for you, Gina, what was it like to share that moment of your mom's end with these people you'll never know?
So, I mean, first of all, I think what Emily was talking about is a thing that she and I do, in fact, talk about all the time. Like, I think that, you know, when you've grown up with the unconditional love of your parents, you already, and I mean, I've come to terms with this over many years. You know, whatever, I grew up in, you know, an environment I didn't want to be in. I grew up, I saw a lot of things that I didn't want to see, but my parents were always a safe haven. And that was true even though my father suffered from a lot of mental health problems. He was gentle in an environment where most men were not gentle, where gentleness was often confused as weakness. Mm-hmm. And my mother, although she wasn't perfect, because no one is, she lived often too vicariously through me because she was of a certain generation and she wasn't happy and fulfilled in her life. And so she put a lot onto me in terms of, we're gonna both live through you. But my mother was my biggest cheerleader. She was always in my corner. And you know, my parents did. They lived with me since 1999. My father died in 2015, my mother in 2019. They were part of my children's upbringing. They were part of essentially my entire adult life since I was about 31 years old, and on a daily basis. And so I think the role in the book, I mean, I invite the reader into the moment of my mother's death for a few reasons. One is that I think my father, although he was a beautiful person and also funny as hell, he took up a lot of air in the room. He had a lot of mental health issues. He had a lot of neuroses. A lot of my mother's and my lives revolved around taking care of him and protecting him. And therefore he takes up a lot of air in the book, because that's what we did. And in the end, kind of coming back, I mean, my book ends when I'm 50. I'm 52 now, and the last section is called The Cartographer's 50 Meditations, and it's told in 50 sections. But kind of coming back to really realizing how core my mother had been to every good thing I had ever been allowed to believe about myself, to every leap of faith I had ever been able to take. And my father's death is depicted in the book too, and it happens 2 months before my cancer diagnosis. It happens in the middle of my divorce, and there's a numbness. There's a veil, a distance between what's happening with my father and my emotional experience of it. And I do still, in retrospect, think that, I didn't have space to give that grief. I was in survival mode. But also, it felt important to me to show that that wasn't a choice I was able to make where my mother was concerned. My mother, the world changed its axis. And it wasn't a tragic death. She was 86 years old. She had cheated death, 100 times by the time she died. It was tragic to no one but me. She had led a full life. But for me, the world was and remains a completely different place without my mother. And she was the one person who there was nothing. I mean, she was my ride or die. She was like the person who would help you bury the body, and so a lot of my book involves being able to put on an act, being able to pretend to be something, to pretend to feel something. And so my mother's death, which actually had not yet occurred when I sold the book to Dan Smetanka, but was put in the revision. My mother's death was the perfect ending because it was the final crack in any artifice I had ever been able to hold. I mean, when my mother died, and for people who have read the scene, like I lost every bit of trying to perform, of even being conscious of myself. The grief was so overpowering that there was no me standing between myself and my behavior. And that was a transformative moment for me. It was not the way I would like to have experienced a transformative moment, but it was the final crack in something that had been starting to fall ever since I had left my marriage, ever since my friend Kathy had died, ever since I had admitted to my affair, all of these different things where it was like I was slowly admitting to the world and to myself that I wasn't who I had pretended to be. And then my mom died and I found her body, and I just had no sense of like what anyone would perceive. So, I write about, the paramedics, the funeral director, all these different people are coming in the room and asking questions, and what it was like to just literally be keening, holding on to somebody's legs, screaming, "Mommy," like trying to climb up a body that had already started decomposing. The loss of self, primacy of grief, and the realization in that moment of like, when my father had died, when Kathy had died, when every other thing that had ever happened to me, there had still been the part of me that was performing the role of myself.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the end.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Gina. If you have questions, put them in the Q&A. I'm not in the chat. So if you have something in there, and we're going to try and find something that makes me happy so that I don't cry in the chat. Gina, where exactly was the neighborhood you lived in your childhood? That's an easy question.
I grew up in inner city Chicago. I grew up near the intersection of Grand and Western. My very best girlfriend in the world, Alicia, teaches at the school I went to, that she and I went to together. You know, the neighborhood has changed a lot since then. There's a lot of gentrification in the city. But one of my cousins was murdered in that neighborhood in 2003. So, I mean, it hadn't changed that much in certain factions. So, yeah. I don't know if I named the exact street in the book, but I will.
Well, if you know where Joey the Clown lived, you know.
Yeah, I did live across the street, but I will decline to be more specific than.
All right. Well, you know, when they start doing the tours of Chicago for your book, you know, it'll be interesting. Okay, let's see here. Melinda has a question. My experience with both divorce and with raising a special needs child were that both of those circumstances were treated by some friends or acquaintances as contagious. Something they could catch if they stuck by me too close. Loss layered on top of loss. And a lot of my peripheral relationships didn't survive those periods. I learned a lot about myself. Ultimately, it lands me in gratitude because I'm not sure without those struggles, I'd have had access to some of the much more authentic, deep relationships I have now. Does this resonate for either of you? Emily, do you want to take that?
Oh, yeah, kick it over here. I'll take that ball. Yeah, I mean, I'd absolutely, yeah. I mean, if you know, it's interesting because I was just having a conversation again with my friend. We're writing this podcast and her husband died of lung cancer. And the first thing people would ask him was, did you smoke? So the first thing people would ask me was, didn't you get tested? Like, again, like, you bad, dumbass woman, like, didn't you get tested? And I was like, yeah, I did, but it wasn't the right test. I didn't know what test to ask for. And I think, you know, absolutely. I feel like it totally resonates with me. And I felt often with, you know, that's what people would say to me when I was out with Ronan. I would die if I were you. It's such an awful thing. Just say anything but that. Like, say you look terrible. That's fine. Like, whatever. But don't say I would die if I were you. Mm-hmm. It's one of the most damaging things that I heard, and I heard it all the time. And it did feel this thing. It's like, you know, it was like, oh, I feel so blessed. Like, your life is so, Charlie. This meeting needs to I know it needs to wrap up, but we will.
One sec, Charlie.
So, just one
Almost
sec.
done.
So people would be like, oh, your life is so shitty. I feel so great now. I mean, poopy. Yeah. Uh-oh.
You're there. We can still see you.
So
one sec, Charlie.
Just a second. You're mad? Okay. She's mad.
I see that. Gina, we'll go to you.
Yeah.
Gina. Oh, do you want to answer that question too, Gina? Go ahead.
So first of all, I would definitely address what Emily had said in that I think we other people who have had situations that make them uncomfortable, right? We other them as a way to pretend it can't happen to us. And, you know, I remember once sitting in a women's studies classroom as an undergraduate, and this is not the first time I've heard this said, but I mean, this is not the only time I've heard this said, but it was the first time, where we were talking about rape and someone in the class very loudly and brazenly said, I'd rather be murdered than raped. And while I fully understand that obviously, you know, clearly I don't think it has to be explained to anyone that rape is traumatic, I already knew from my background that there had to be numerous women in that room who had been raped. and have someone sitting there, I'd rather be dead, and was a way of telling these women, I'd rather be dead than you. Your life doesn't have value. You've been ruined. And I do think when you go through things, you not only find out, of course, who your real friends are, but you make new relationships with people who understand what it's like to bear witness. I was told very early on in my breast cancer by someone in an email that there would be things about my experience that would be valuable and beautiful. And I remember reading it at the time and thinking, like, what utter bullshit. I don't want cancer. I don't want any stupid beauty that comes out of cancer. Fuck everything. I don't want, like, just get me out of this room, this pink ribbon room. No, I don't belong here. But they were right. And you find other people when you're in a situation that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. You find the people who it doesn't make uncomfortable, and you find the people who can sit with you with it. And, I think everyone, look, if you're 52, like I am, like you've had something happen to you that made other people uncomfortable. Maybe you hid it so that they weren't uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
But you don't get through this life without having something happen to you that other people squirm about.
Right.
And I do think certain relationships fade and other ones come to the forefront when you learn who can stand in the thick with you.
Mm-hmm.
There's thank you for that. There's two questions that are sort of related to each other. About one is specifically about your book, Gina, but also just about both your books in general, which is, do you feel essentially the need in both of your books to, by the end of them, show some sort of growth or evolution in yourself that makes you look or seem better than perhaps what reality was?
No. So let me tell you guys, I'm just in terms of a craft issue. So I wanted to end this book. So, I mean, of course, obviously, before I got cancer, I didn't know I was going to get cancer. So to me, the end of the book was going to be my father's death. And at that time, I'm in the middle of a tumultuous divorce, but it's still maybe not 100% certain that maybe my ex and I could reunite. And I'm still in a relationship with my lover, but he's in a deep depression and is still living with his ex-wife, and coming back and forth to Chicago for very short periods of time while my kids are like, basically, thanks for this, shitstorm. And I wanted to leave myself there. I wanted to just leave myself right there and be like, no solution, write your own end. What do you think happens to this woman? And if it were a novel, that's what I would have done.
Right.
But after my experience of cancer, which also happened as my divorce became more and more tumultuous, I began to understand that this was part of the book, largely because I also wanted to talk about the way bodies that have been sick or have had a disability or have been altered are treated, both in terms of misogyny, in terms of sexuality, all of these things. So I ended up including that. And one of the quote downsides of that was that my romantic relationship did resolve during that period of time. The depression ended, my partner moved to Chicago. We were very happy. We got engaged. We're now married. And I didn't like that part. I mean, I like it in my life, very happy about it in my life, but I didn't like it in the book because I think too many books about women end with like, and then the love worked out.
Becomes Jane Austen.
And albeit I don't think that I portray my relationship with my husband as one that is sort of the traditional savior type situation. But I wanted to leave myself flapping in the wind. I was flapping in the wind in other ways. I didn't know how long I'd be alive. I didn't know if the cancer would come back. I had, a different body. I had a dead mother. I mean, my divorce had gotten a lot worse and I'd gone through that. And so, so there were other things of unrest, but I absolutely did not want to somehow conclude with now I have learned my lesson.
Right.
Now I'm such a good person. All of that's behind me now, because I think there is no end. And I talk about that in the book. Like
Right.
There's an end in novels. We say where our characters stop living and we may think about them, but there is no real them doing other things in the world after the book ends, only in our heads.
Right.
But I'm a real person doing other things in the world after the book ends. And so it's like, I talk about the fact that really death is the only end. And like, sorry, people, I can't, like, I may screw up again. I may do something else. Like everything else may fall apart. I may, whatever. So I resisted that as hard as I could. I hope I resisted it successfully.
I know you want to go.
Emily, this is your last answer.
Okay. Yep. The ring light's gone. Okay. No, it's not. Okay. Yeah. The spoiler alert, everyone dies. That's my final parting thought. I'm going to have to go because this isn't going to be, but
we're going to end the evening. So stay right there for 1 second, Emily.
Oh, you want to say goodbye?
Goodbye.
No.
Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. This was a great conversation. I hope you guys got a lot out of it. I know that I did. It's always a pleasure getting to chat with my friends, Emily and Gina. These are the kind of conversations we have just when we're hanging out at the bar, by the way. Let me show you their books. If you haven't bought them yet, you must buy them right now. Go to bookshop.org, go to Amazon, go to wherever Maggie has sent you links in the chat. Emily Rapp Black's brand new book, Sanctuary, is out now. You can get it anywhere. It is absolutely remarkable. It's a heartbreaker, but will also leave you feeling like a better person upon this earth. And Gina Frangello's brand new book, Blow Your House Down, available right now from Counterpoint Press. Literally is out just this. It's been out for like a week, and it is absolutely stirring work. And you will leave changed from this as well. Thank you all so much for coming tonight. I hope you had a good time. This will be on YouTube in about a week. If you want to share it with friends and family, watch it at Christmas time, that sort of thing. And that's Charlie. Say hi, Charlie.
Hi, Charlie.
Gina,
Miss you. I saw you last week.
Good night, everybody.